What family routine did you think was normal until someone outside questioned it? The scent of burnt popcorn and stale beer usually defines the end of my weekend here at State, but the smell that truly signals Sunday night for me is something colder, the metallic tang of dread. Even 400 miles away in my dorm room, the anticipation of the weekly family check-in makes my stomach clench. My roommate Chloe was out with her philosophy study group, thankfully. I needed the silence. I dragged my battered laptop onto my desk, opened the video conference software, and checked the clock. 7:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the mandatory family efficiency review, or as my parents call it, the inventory. My parents, Mark and Ellen, are both successful, rigid, and absolutely obsessed with optimization. Growing up, the concept of time and resources as measurable assets wasn't a philosophy, it was a religion. Every Sunday for as long as I could remember, we gathered around the dining table. After I went to college, it moved to Zoom, but the format never changed. The screen flickered to life. There were my parents already seated at their pristine white kitchen island back home in Boston, looking like two stern news anchors. My little sister, Mia, 16, already had that glazed-over look in her eyes. "Sarah, you're on time. 2 points for punctuality." My dad, Mark, said immediately, his eyes already scanning the detailed spreadsheet he had shared on the screen. He bypassed, "How was your week?" and went straight to the numbers. The spreadsheet was color-coded, and I knew every column by heart. Weekly budget, variance, scheduled study time, adherence, social energy, expenditure categorized by necessity, waste, and the dreaded emotional overhead. Let's start with budget variance. "Mom," Ellen clipped in her voice, always sharp and precise. "You spent an extra $12.50 on the campus coffee shop. The projected rate was $15. Did you track this as a necessary boost or a comfort purchase?" "Necessary boost, Mom," I recited automatically. I was pulling an all-nighter for my psych final. The caffeine intake maximized focus, leading to a B+. Dad frowned slightly. "A B is 88%. We projected an AI. The $12.50 expenditure did not yield the optimized return. That's a 3 on the weekly efficiency score, Sarah." Mia giggled nervously, quickly covering her mouth. I shot her a look. She was probably terrified they'd check her phone usage next. It all felt so normal to me. This was how we lived. We were a highly functional, optimized unit. We didn't talk about feelings unless they were quantifiable. Did a situation cause measurable stress, high overhead, or measurable happiness, high return? Everything else was irrelevant noise. It was only 2 days ago that someone challenged it. I was in the library trying to parse through my week's data before the meeting when my new friend Ethan leaned over my shoulder. "Whoa, what is this, a quarterly report?" he joked, looking at my chart of social energy expenditure. "Oh, it's just the weekly family report." I'd replied casually, highlighting the section where I'd marked my attendance at a club meeting as necessary networking +5. Ethan's smile had vanished. "You grade your week and your parents give you points based on your feelings, like, if you spent an hour crying, would that be a negative score?" "Well, yes." I'd explained, slightly confused by his intensity. Crying is high emotional overhead, which is low yield unless it directly leads to problem solving. It's inefficient. Ethan had just stared at me, slowly pushing his chair back. "Sarah," he'd whispered, that's not normal. That's corporate parenting. That's disturbing." The word disturbing hit me like a physical punch. It lodged itself in my chest, a foreign, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't assign a score to. Now watching my dad click the mouse ready to move onto the next metric, Maya's recent failure to negotiate a better deal on her phone plan resulting in a 8 for her. I couldn't shake Ethan's horrified face. Maybe it wasn't normal. Maybe my whole life I'd been living under a strange emotional glass ceiling. "All right, Sarah," Dad said, pulling me back to the screen. "Let's review unscheduled free time. We show a 2-hour block on Thursday evening." I swallowed, glancing at the clock. The meeting was just beginning, and this week I was suddenly seeing the whole system through Ethan's eyes. It didn't look like optimization anymore. It looked like control. My heart hammered against my ribs, a loud, inefficient thump that probably would have cost me points if my parents could measure it. As Dad finished reviewing Mia's minor financial failure, a $15 overdraft fee, due to poor planning, which he dubbed an avoidable resource hemorrhage, he returned his laser focus to me. "The 2-hour unscheduled block on Thursday, Sarah. Explain the use of that time. Was it recreational necessary recovery, or did it involve low-yield social interaction?" He pressed his expression unchanging. Mia was frantically typing notes to herself, probably marking down avoid ATMs on Tuesdays as a life lesson. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice as steady and data-driven as possible. "It was recovery, Dad. I had completed 90% of my planned work for the week by Wednesday night. The block was used for passive rejuvenation, watching a documentary on sustainable architecture unrelated to my major but categorized as necessary cognitive refueling. It prepared me for peak performance during my Friday morning seminar." It was a lie, of course. I'd spent those 2 hours talking to Ethan about everything and nothing, movies, weird campus politics, and the surreal feeling of being completely alone for the first time. It was the least efficient, most necessary 2 hours of my week. I wouldn't dare categorize it as low-yield social interaction. That carried a minimum penalty of 5. Mom narrowed her eyes, zooming in on the spreadsheet where I'd vaguely logged the time as R&R. You logged it as rest and recuperation, Sarah, which often indicates time spent sleeping or meditating. This was active consumption. Did you generate notes? Did this documentary improve your grade outcome? It generated context and broadened my perspective. I countered, falling back on the kind of corporate jargon they respected. The improved mental agility is an unquantifiable long-term asset. There was a long pause. Dad leaned back, considering the defense. I held my breath, mentally calculating the damage if they found out I'd been with Ethan. I hadn't told them about him. Relationships were inherently volatile and ranked as extremely high emotional overhead, negative ROI. Finally, Dad nodded, a slow, grudging movement. Acceptable defense, though we recommend logging the specific asset type in the future. We cannot optimize what we do not measure, Sarah. Your score remains stable. Stable. The relief washed over me. I'd survived another week. Then my mom dropped the bomb. Moving on, she said, tapping her screen. We received a notification from your campus housing about a guest who was in your room past visitor hours last Tuesday. My blood ran cold. Ethan had brought me takeout and stayed late helping me set up a new coding project. I'd forgotten to log him out on the electronic guest log when he left around 1 a.m., 30 minutes past the limit. Sarah, Dad said, his voice flatlining, which was far scarier than if he'd yelled. This is a breach of security protocol and a lapse in personal accountability. Who was this unlogged asset? I looked at their faces. No concern for my safety, only the procedural failure. They didn't care who was there, only that I hadn't followed the rules. It was Ethan. I whispered the name, feeling like a confession. A classmate. We were working on a joint assignment. Ethan, Mom repeated, pulling up another window. Did we vet Ethan? Is he listed in your necessary professional network? No, Mom. He's just a friend. The silence on the video call was suffocating. I suddenly saw the room through Ethan's eyes again, a tribunal, not a family meeting. A random variable. Dad finally stated, summarizing Ethan's existence. Unscheduled, unvetted, and a direct cause of a policy violation. This represents a critical failure in risk assessment and a massive drain on your focus metrics this week. It jeopardizes your entire academic investment. He clicked his mouse and a red bar flashed across my line on the spreadsheet. The efficiency score plummeted. Effective immediately, Mom declared, her voice ice cold. Your budget is frozen until we receive a full written report on the ROI of this Ethan. You need to reassess your priorities, Sarah. This is an unacceptable level of emotional waste. The screen was filled with red and black numbers. My score was the lowest it had been since I failed to win the regional science fair in 7th grade. I was being financially punished for a casual friendship. And for the first time, I didn't feel shame for the low score. I felt rage at the entire ridiculous system. The Zoom call ended with the definitive click of my father closing the shared spreadsheet. The screen reverted to my image, a pale, stunned face staring back from the harsh fluorescent light of my dorm. The silence was heavy, but the impact of their last words, emotional waste, lingered, ringing louder than any actual argument we could have had. I immediately tried my debit card on a takeout app. Declined. They weren't bluffing. My food budget, my gas allowance, my minor emergency fund all locked down until I could justify Ethan's existence in a 500-word essay with supporting data. The sheer absurdity of it made my fingers tremble. I threw on a jacket and headed straight to the library where I knew Ethan would be studying late. I found him hunched over his engineering texts, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he saw my face, his own instantly softened. Hey, what's wrong? You look like you just came from a tax audit. Worse, I said, slumping into the chair across from him. The inventory. I got grounded, financially. I explained the frozen budget, the policy breach, and the ultimate requirement, the report on investment return, ROI, of a Thana person. As I spoke, I laid out the logic of my family's life, how happiness was a metric, how friendships were assessed for professional gain, and how any moment not spent advancing a quantifiable goal was labeled waste. Ethan listened without interrupting, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a deep, concerned frown. When I finished, the silence was longer than any pause in the Sunday meeting. Sarah, he said finally, his voice low. I thought you were exaggerating. But this isn't just rigorous parenting. This is treating human relationships like stock portfolios. That's not love, that's surveillance. The word surveillance hit me harder than disturbing. He was right. Every single moment of my life, even moments of simple rest or connection, was under their watchful, quantifying gaze. They just want me to write a report saying you're helping me study or, connecting me to some internship, I whispered, rubbing my temples. I could fake it. I've faked efficiency scores my whole life. And then what? Ethan challenged gently. Next week, they'll want a 6-month projection. Then they'll want to vet my own efficiency score. Sarah, you have to stop playing their game. His words, while simple, were the first real catalyst for rebellion I'd ever experienced. My fear of the low score was slowly being replaced by a visceral need to reclaim my own time and self. The following day was awful. I skipped my usual coffee shop treat because I literally couldn't afford it. I ate ramen I'd hoarded from last semester. Every moment felt controlled, measured, and miserable. By Tuesday afternoon, I felt brittle. I knew I needed to violate the efficiency protocol not for the high-risk Ethan interaction, but just for me. I walked past the university's central lawn and saw a group of students playing frisbee. It was completely unplanned, had zero academic merit, and involved unquantifiable physical and social expenditure. I didn't join them, but I found a quiet bench under a big old oak tree and just sat there for 30 minutes. I watched the clouds move. I listened to the distant music from a passing car. I breathed. It was pure, unadulterated, low-yield waste. It was wonderful. I knew my parents had installed monitoring software on my laptop and probably tracked my GPS data via my phone bill categorized as safety compliance high yield. They would eventually see the 30-minute block of total inactivity logged outside my usual zones. But for the first time, I didn't care about the inevitable negative score. I felt a surge of autonomy I hadn't realized I was missing. That evening, I sat down to write the report on investment return for Ethan. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I knew exactly what they wanted. Ethan Smith peer asset currently yields 15% increase in Python coding speed. But as I looked at the blank screen, I remembered Ethan's face not as a random variable, but as a mirror reflecting the abnormality of my life. I deleted the placeholder. I decided I wouldn't lie. If they wanted data, I would give them my data, the data that couldn't be quantified in dollars or grades. Dear Mark and Ellen. I began feeling the thrilling, terrifying adrenaline of defiance. The purpose of this report is to analyze the ROI of the asset known as Ethan on my personal and psychological portfolio. I knew this wasn't just a report. It was a declaration of war against the scorecard. I spent the next 2 days crafting the ROI report, not as an apology, but as a meticulously reasoned manifesto. My parents respected data, so I would give them data, just not the kind they were used to. I submitted the 1,000-word document late Wednesday night, deliberately violating the 500-word limit just to push the boundary. The title alone was a violation of their core principles. Asset Analysis Ethan Smith Yielding Essential Non-Monetary Psychological Capital. Instead of Python coding speeds, I focused on the measurable reduction of negative stress caused by the constant pressure of the inventory. I argued, metric emotional overhead, stress reduction. Since meeting Ethan, my recorded sleep latency time to fall asleep had decreased by an average of 14 minutes, a plus 10 an efficiency gain. Reasoning. Healthy social interaction acts as a necessary buffer against performance anxiety, reducing cortisol production. Metric cognitive burnout prevention. The 2-hour block of low-yield social interaction on Thursday prevented a projected 5-hour dip in focus on Friday, a net plus 3 gain in output. Reasoning. The introduction of a random variable interrupts detrimental cyclical thought patterns. I didn't lie about Ethan's activities, but I framed them in terms of their psychological utility. I concluded the report with the most dangerous statement of all. The primary yield of this asset is the validation of subjective experience. As a result, the time spent with Ethan represents an investment in long-term mental sustainability, an asset far more valuable than short-term grade optimization. I didn't hear back for 24 hours. That silence was more unnerving than a negative score. On Thursday morning, I received a single email. The subject line was chilling. RE Asset Analysis Mandatory Midweek Review Scheduled. Attached was a calendar invite for 8:00 p.m. EST that very night. No video call link was provided. The location was simply listed as the family unit. This meant they weren't going to have a formal Zoom meeting. They were going to call me on the phone. A phone call meant no shared spreadsheet, no visual cues, just pure, unedited verbal confrontation. I called Ethan immediately. He was excited and terrified for me. You basically wrote them a thesis on why their whole system is broken, he said. They're furious, but they also can't dismiss it because it's so structured. You beat them at their own game. They froze my account, Ethan. I'm running on instant noodles and pure adrenaline. I have nothing left to lose. I replied, the fear replaced by a strange cold clarity. That night at precisely 8:00 p.m., my phone rang. The screen displayed my dad's cell number. I took a deep breath, ignored my pounding heart, and answered. Hello, Dad. Hello, Mom. Dad's voice was low, heavy, and completely devoid of the usual clipped efficiency. Sarah, we have read your submission. We note the exceeding of the word count a basic failure in following parameters. I needed the space to fully articulate the data, Dad. I countered immediately using their own language. Cutting the analysis would have compromised the integrity of the findings. Do not use semantics with us, Sarah. Mom cut in her voice, sounding dangerously restrained. The purpose of the inventory is to ensure optimal performance aligned with established family goals. You are attempting to introduce subjective experiences and emotional waste into a functional process. I am showing you that ignoring the psychological factors is the true inefficiency, I argued, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles were white. The time spent with Ethan allowed me to avoid a major stress meltdown that would have cost days of productivity. That is a measurable ROI. There was a pause. I could hear my dad sigh, a slow, deliberate sound of profound disappointment. We are not fools, Sarah. We see what you are doing. You are redefining waste as wellness because you resent accountability. This is not about Ethan. This is about control, yours and ours. I felt the sudden shocking urge to cry, but I forced the emotion back. High overhead, low yield. It is about defining the goal, Dad. My goal is mental health and academic success. Your system only measures the latter while actively sabotaging the former. The line went silent again. Then my dad spoke, and his words set the stage for the true escalation. We are unfreezing your budget, Sarah. Effective immediately. Your report, however, has demonstrated a critical shift in your core values. This cannot be addressed in a weekly review. Your mother and I are scheduling a visit to campus next month. We will need to conduct a thorough in-person audit of your environment and your social network. We will meet Ethan and determine his true ROI with our own metrics. My entire body went numb. They were coming here. They weren't just going to judge my spreadsheet. They were going to audit my whole life. When exactly are you coming? I managed to ask. The second weekend of next month. Mom replied, her voice now carrying a note of cold victory. Be ready, Sarah. We expect maximum efficiency. The dread that had previously confined itself to Sunday evenings now hung over me like a permanent cloud. The threat of the in-person audit was an absolute game changer. My parents weren't just going to look at my spreadsheets. They were coming to analyze the variables in the field. My budget was back, but it felt less like a freedom and more like bait. The first person I told was Ethan. We met at an independent coffee shop far off campus, a place they wouldn't know to check, and I watched his face fall as I delivered the news. They're coming to meet me to determine my true ROI. He ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely worried for me. Sarah, this is intense. This isn't just about efficiency. This is about asserting dominance. They see me as a faulty product that needs recalling and retuning, I said grimly. They'll analyze my dorm room for organizational waste. They'll time my commute to classes, and they'll grill you until you admit you're a negative influence. I'm not going to admit that, Ethan vowed. But what are we supposed to do? Should we pretend I'm your calculus tutor? I shook my head. Lying won't work. They'll sense the fabrication. The only way to survive an audit is to give them so much data they choke on it. We need to define the narrative before they do. The next 3 weeks were a frantic scramble. I started doing things I never would have done before, all in preparation for the audit. First, I had to optimize the dorm room. I bought clear plastic organizers and filed every receipt, every syllabus, and every piece of mail. I alphabetized my bookshelf and color-coded my notes. It looked like a showroom for minimalist living, a prison of perfection. Second, I had to brief Ethan. We held rehearsal sessions where he had to answer questions about his major, his career goals, and his projected social contributions. If your mom asks why you spend time with me, what do you say? I prompted, holding up an imaginary microphone. Because Sarah's ability to compartmentalize and utilize time effectively creates a low-stress environment conducive to high-level intellectual exchange. Ethan rattled off perfectly. Wrong, too passive, I corrected. Say, because our combined intellectual agility accelerates problem-solving, yielding a higher ROI than solo study time. Always use active verbs, Ethan groaned. Your life is exhausting. It's efficient. I corrected automatically, then sighed. See, I can't stop doing it either. The night before the audit, I was a wreck. My parents were staying at a hotel downtown. They wouldn't dare sleep in the suboptimal conditions of campus lodging. I found myself obsessively cleaning the same smudge off my window pane. Suddenly, a text message popped up. It wasn't from Ethan. MIA. The forecast calls for suboptimal weather. Be ready, Sarah. They're bringing the clipboards. My younger sister, Mia. Her messages were always cryptic, a necessary survival tactic. She couldn't risk direct communication. I realized she was giving me a critical, non-quantifiable variable. My parents' mood would be worse if the weather was bad. The next morning, the sun was shining, a victory for my stress levels. My parents arrived precisely at 10:00 a.m. They didn't hug me. They didn't smile. Dad was carrying a leather briefcase and Mom had a clipboard. They entered the dorm room and immediately began their visual assessment. The organizational structure is improved, Dad noted, walking straight to my desk and running a gloved finger over the surface, checking for dust. But the layout does not maximize ambient light for peak cognitive function. -2 on room efficiency. Mom, meanwhile, was scrutinizing my wardrobe, neatly arranged by color and fabric type. Too many pieces of recreational clothing, Sarah. You have over-allocated budget towards leisure identity. We need to trim the redundancy. They audited my class schedule, my syllabus, and even cross-referenced my meal plan against the optimal calorie nutrient intake spreadsheet they kept at home. The entire morning was a suffocating barrage of negative metrics. I managed to keep my responses purely data-driven, avoiding any mention of feelings. I was an optimized machine, and they were the technicians. Then at 1:00 p.m. the moment arrived. Ethan walked into the dorm lounge where we were waiting. He was dressed neatly, he was on time, and he was ready for the Inquisition. My dad didn't offer a handshake. He pulled out a laminated card with a list of questions. Ethan, my father began, his voice dry and authoritative. Let's establish your baseline ROI. Ethan sat down, looked Mark and Ellen right in the eye, and gave them the first answer, the one we hadn't rehearsed. "Before we start, sir and ma'am," Ethan said calmly, "I wanted to thank you. Sarah's training in time management is exceptional. It allows her to create free time where others fail. That time, the time you consider waste, is where the real ROI lies, because that's when she actually talks about her feelings, which is what I'm here for." My parents froze, clipboards half raised. He had just broken their entire frame of reference. My parents froze. The silence in the dorm lounge was so thick I could hear the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. Ethan had not only broken their system, but he'd also used their language ROI efficiency to elevate the very thing they feared most, unquantifiable human emotion. Dad recovered first. His face hardened, the veneer of the objective auditor cracking to reveal the terrified parent underneath. "Mr. Smith," Dad said, leaning forward, his voice a low growl, "your assessment lacks analytical rigor. Talking about feelings is a high-overhead activity. We have explicitly trained Sarah to process stress internally and efficiently. You are introducing a parasitic element into her established mechanism. And that mechanism is failing," Ethan countered calmly without a trace of defiance, just simple conviction. "It generates measurable anxiety. Sarah's internal efficiency is so high that she suppresses necessary emotional processing, leading to chronic sleep debt and potential burnout. Talking isn't parasitic, sir. It's preventative maintenance. My ROI is ensuring her long-term stability." Mom slammed her clipboard onto the table. "You believe her stress is our fault." The interrogation had suddenly shifted from Ethan's metrics to the core family dynamic. This was the moment I had to step in. "Mom, Dad, stop," I said, putting my hands flat on the table. "Ethan is right. My psychological portfolio is dangerously imbalanced, and your system created the deficit." I stared them down, forcing myself to hold their gaze. This felt more terrifying than any low score they could give me. Do you remember my first week of high school?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "I came home on Friday exhausted and overwhelmed. I'd missed the bus because I was confused about the route and had to walk 3 miles. I was terrified I'd be late for the inventory." I paused, letting the memory sit heavy in the air. "When I finally sat down for the review that Sunday, I started to cry. You didn't ask me what was wrong. You calculated the 3-mile walk as time waste and the tears as emotional overhead, giving me a 15 on the board. You told me I needed to process the failure efficiently and prepare for the next week." My parents' faces didn't change, but their posture did. They stiffened, not with anger, but with the cold shock of recall. "I didn't talk about my stress for 4 years after that." I continued pushing my advantage. "I internalized everything because the cost of admission to your system was suppressing all true emotion. That cost wasn't worth the score." Mom opened her mouth to argue, but Dad cut her off. His composure was shattered. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the table, running his thumb nervously over the edge of the leather briefcase. That was about teaching responsibility, Sarah." Dad muttered, his voice unusually soft, betraying a crack in his conviction. "Not about punishing stress." "But that's how the data was read," I insisted. "And the data defined the rule." The air went dead. Ethan, sensing the shift, remained silent, a supportive presence beside me. My parents realized that every quantifiable metric they had ever used had just been weaponized against the qualitative failure of their parenting. They couldn't win this argument because their own data, my emotional history, was the primary exhibit against them. Dad abruptly stood up, slamming his hand down on the table, not in anger, but in finality. "This audit is concluded." Mom quickly gathered her papers, avoiding my eyes. They hadn't even looked at the detailed ROI report I'd written. "We are returning to the hotel immediately," Mom stated, her voice regaining its cold authority. "Your weekly allowance will not be altered, however." She paused, her gaze locking onto Ethan. "We are adjusting your time allocation. Effective immediately, you are forbidden from spending more than 2 cumulative hours per week with any unvetted social asset, including Mr. Smith. You will log every minute in next week's report under the category Controlled Waste." She was trying to reassert control by measuring the waste. She was giving me the freedom to waste time, but only on her terms. "We will call you Sunday," Dad said sharply, already heading for the door. "Do not violate the new time parameter." They swept out, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unfinished conflict. I looked at Ethan, my eyes wide. 2 hours, I breathed. They put a literal time limit on our friendship. Ethan smiled sadly, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "That means we must be worth much more than 2 hours of their time, Sarah. We're officially a threat to their system." The week that followed the audit was the strangest one yet. My parents had retreated, but their rules were now more invasive than ever. The 2-hour weekly limit on controlled waste, my time with Ethan felt like a tiny allowance for breathing. Ethan and I immediately had to become meticulous timekeepers. We didn't want to break the rule entirely, not yet anyway, because they would just freeze my budget again, and I needed the freedom that money provided to plan my next move. Our friendship, once spontaneous and easy, became a high-stakes military operation. On Monday, we scheduled exactly 45 minutes to grab dinner. Ethan timed me. Okay, 15 minutes for the walk, 20 minets for eating, 10 minutes to walk back. That leaves us 0 minutes for discussion about your feelings, he joked grimly as we raced to the cafeteria. On Wednesday, we met in the darkest corner of the engineering lab under the guise of accelerated study. We set a timer for 1 hour and 10 minutes, pretending to debate circuit boards while actually discussing our shared disgust for the controlled waste label. I can't believe they think they can quantify connection, Ethan muttered, pretending to check a wire. They're trying to prove that if they set the boundaries, the feelings will stay within them. They think everything is a closed system, I replied, feeling the familiar pressure creeping back. My life, my emotions, all inputs and outputs must be predictable. We are the variables they failed to predict. By Friday afternoon, we had logged 1 hour and 55 minutes. We had only 5 minutes left for the entire weekend, including the inevitable Sunday call. This is ridiculous, Ethan said, pulling me to a stop near the library steps. 5 minutes, we can't even say goodbye properly. This is exactly what they want, I realized. By limiting the time, they are limiting the depth. They know that deep, unplanned connection is what fuels my rebellion. That evening, I got a text from my sister Mia. She hadn't messaged since the audit. MIA. Look up the old photo albums. The red one. Mom kept a score, Sarah. The message was cryptic, but the sense of urgency was clear. My parents had warned Mia about communicating with me, so she was resorting to riddles. I realized I needed to act immediately. I couldn't drive home, so I called my Aunt Claire, my mother's younger sister, who had always been slightly estranged from the family because she chose to become an artist, the epitome of unquantifiable waste. I told Aunt Claire I needed a copy of an old photo album, claiming it was for a history project. Aunt Claire, bless her chaotic soul, never asked for details. The next day, a package arrived from her. It was the red photo album, dense with stiff yellowing pages, but tucked inside the cover was an unlabeled CD and a handwritten note from Claire. They never liked things out of place, sweetheart. Look deeper. I opened the CD on my laptop. It was an old file dated nearly 15 years ago. It was a digital copy of an old spreadsheet, one far more complex than the efficiency reports of today. The title was Sarah and Mia Developmental Metrics Efficiency Compliance and Emotional Overhead Index. My heart hammered as I scrolled through the data. It wasn't just my grades and budget from my teenage years. This data went all the way back to when I was 5 years old. There were columns for time spent engaging in imaginary play waste, score on sharing compliance, total minutes cried per month overhead. But the most shocking column was the last one, labeled projected deviation. It was a prediction graph. Every time I had an outburst, showed unsolicited curiosity, or expressed strong unquantifiable emotion, the projected deviation score would spike. I saw the line spike sharply when I was 7, the time I wanted a blue bike instead of the scientifically safer red one they had chosen. I saw it spike again at age 10 when I secretly wrote a short story instead of reviewing my math flashcards. I wasn't just being managed, I was being engineered to prevent deviation from their predetermined path. The inventory wasn't a routine. It was a decades-long experiment to create the perfect, efficient daughter. Then I looked at Mia's data, which ran parallel to mine. Mia's projected deviation was consistently low. She was their successful experiment. She was the one who didn't question the system, yet she was the one who had just risked communicating with me. I realized then that my little sister wasn't compliant. She was a perfect actor, a flawless asset, because that was the only way she could survive, and she was using her cover to help me expose them. The old developmental metrics spreadsheet was a devastating revelation. It wasn't merely a record of past scores. It was the entire blueprint for my upbringing, a predictive algorithm designed to minimize my individuality. The chilling clarity of the data my childhood tears, measured as overhead, made the rage I felt during the audit seem mild. This was deeply personal, and it explained everything. I immediately called Ethan, breaking the controlled waste limit without a moment's hesitation. The time limit no longer mattered. I was operating outside their system now. Ethan, you have to come over. I found the real inventory. I told him, my voice tight with adrenaline. He arrived 15 minutes later, and I showed him the old spreadsheet. He scrolled through the columns, his eyes widening with every line item. This is dystopian, he breathed, stopping at the imaginary play waste column. They logged the time you spent playing pretend as waste, Sarah. This confirms that your entire sense of normal was manufactured. And look at Mia's data, I pointed out, showing him the consistently low projected deviation score. She was the compliant one, the perfect product. She played the game so flawlessly she became invisible to their monitoring. Wait, Ethan said, tapping the screen. If she's so compliant, why is she risking contact now? She sent you that text. Why would she jeopardize her own perfect score? Because she realized that compliance isn't the same as safety. I said, a wave of realization washing over me. She's safe from their metrics, but she's still trapped by their expectations. Just then my phone rang. It wasn't my parents, it was Mia. She never called. I answered, pulling the phone away slightly, my heart pounding. Mia, are you okay? Her voice was barely a whisper, frantic and laced with panic. Sarah, they know. They found the message to Aunt Claire. They know about the album. What did they do? They just told me that since I have demonstrated a deviation from established loyalty protocols, they are adjusting my college trajectory. They canceled my early application to the East Coast school, the one I wanted, and said I will now be attending the state school closer to home where they can monitor my recalibration for the next 4 years. My breath hitched. They had just crushed her future not with financial punishment but by taking away her choice, her highest yield asset, for a minor act of solidarity. The cost of her failure was 4 years of direct surveillance. Mia, listen to me, I urged, trying to sound calm. This is fear. They're afraid of what you might know. You need to log off, act completely contrite, and give them the most efficient performance of your life. I am, she wept softly. But Sarah, they said they are flying up this weekend, not next month. They're flying up tonight to conduct the final operational assessment. They were coming in less than 24 hours. They had accelerated the confrontation, bypassing the Sunday call entirely. They weren't just checking my room, they were coming to re-establish total control. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. The inventory wasn't a routine. It was a crisis management tool, and they were activating the highest level of response. They were coming for me, and they were using Mia's punishment as a public service announcement. Deviation is not tolerated. Ethan, I said, looking at the screen displaying my childhood data. We don't have time to plan. They'll be here tomorrow. They're coming to take me down, and they're going to dismantle my unvetted asset while they're at it. Ethan looked at the developmental metrics spreadsheet, then back at me. He understood the gravity immediately. No, he said, standing up with a newfound seriousness. We're not going to let them audit you. We're going to audit them. How? We know the data they fear the most, he said, pointing to the spreadsheet. They fear the unquantifiable, the irrational, the waste. We are going to give them a final inventory, one they can't possibly score. Ethan and I worked through the night, fueled by instant coffee and the cold terror of their impending arrival. We knew the final operational assessment wasn't about grades or money. It was about crushing my newfound autonomy and making an example out of me, just as they had done to Mia. They're coming prepared to dismantle your support system and reinstall compliance software, Ethan stated, pacing my room as the first hint of dawn colored the window. We can't hide anything. We have to make their metrics irrelevant. Our plan was radical. If they demanded quantifiable data, we would give them a sensory overload of the unquantifiable. First, the room. We deliberately de-optimized it. We took all the meticulously organized files and tossed them into a giant colorful pile in the center of the floor. We pulled my leisure identity clothes out of the closet and hung them haphazardly on the wall. We tacked up handwritten quotes and abstract sketches. Pure inefficient art everywhere. The goal was to replace sterile order with chaotic, spontaneous life. Second, the meeting location. I rented the dorm's small, rarely used common kitchen, which smelled perpetually of old grease and burnt toast. It was the antithesis of their pristine Boston kitchen island. We prepared for the confrontation there. Third, the data delivery. Ethan realized that the key to breaking their system was attacking the emotional overhead metric. They categorized tears as waste and silence as efficiency. Right, Ethan argued. We need to flood them with raw, unedited feeling, the very thing they've spent 20 years engineering out of your life. My parents arrived at 10:30 a.m. precisely. They didn't call or text. They simply appeared at my dorm door, my father holding his leather briefcase, my mother clutching her clipboard like a shield. They stopped dead in the doorway, staring at the deliberate, beautiful mess of my room. Sarah, my mother breathed aghast. What is this organizational failure? It's an accurate reflection of a creative, functional mind, Mom, I answered, keeping my voice steady. But the assessment is scheduled for the common area. We led them to the small kitchen. Ethan was already there, leaning against the counter, relaxed. He didn't jump up. He didn't offer a corporate handshake. He just smiled easily. My dad didn't sit down. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of printouts, my old ROI reports. Let's begin, Sarah. We are conducting a terminal failure analysis on your recent behavior. Before you begin, Dad, I interrupted, placing a sheet of paper on the table. I have prepared the final inventory. The data is non-negotiable. The paper wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a poem I had secretly written years ago, a raw emotional outburst against the metrics disguised as a list of abstract nouns. I had titled it, The True Overhead. The true overhead is not the minute spent laughing, but the hour spent suppressing the laughter. The true inefficiency is not the dollar wasted on coffee, but the life wasted on measuring the dollar. The true deviation is not the pursuit of joy, but the adherence to a joyless structure. My parents exchanged a look of pure bewilderment. They didn't have a column for poetry. What is this nonsense, Sarah? Mom demanded, swatting the paper away. This is noise. It's the metric you created, Mom, I said, pointing at my father's briefcase. This is the emotional overhead you measured when I was 7. This is the time waste you penalized when I was 12. You asked for my life data. This is the cost of compliance. I then turned to Ethan. Ethan's ROI is simple. He is the witness to this pain. He validates the subjective experience that your system demands I suppress. His yield is authenticity. My father's face was white. He hadn't expected to be confronted with the results of his own long-term data collection. "We are leaving Ellen," Dad stated, reaching for his mother. "This is a volatile environment. We are ending the assessment now." "No," I said, blocking their path to the door. "You came here to deliver a final ruling on my life. I deserve to hear it, and you deserve to hear the cost of Mia's recalibration." I told them about Mia's tears, about the cancellation of her dream, and how they had sacrificed her future for a minor breach of loyalty. My mother's composure finally broke. She looked at my father, her eyes wide. "Mark, did we truly cancel her East Coast application?" Dad looked down, unable to meet either of our eyes. "It was a necessary measure to ensure the integrity of the family unit." "The integrity of the unit is gone, Dad," I whispered. "It died when you started measuring your children for waste." They realized then that they had lost. They had lost the narrative, they had lost control of the audit, and they had driven their most compliant child into the arms of the one they tried to control. They looked defeated, stripped of their metrics and their authority. They simply couldn't score the chaos I had presented. "You have made your choice, Sarah," my father finally said, his voice hollow. He didn't utter a final score, a punishment, or a decree. He just acknowledged the irreparable damage. "I have," I replied, "and my efficiency score is the highest it has ever been." My parents left the common kitchen in silence, gathering their clipboards and their defeated data. They didn't look back. There was no grand scene, no final decree, just the quiet acknowledgement of a fundamental breach that their metrics could not repair. Their power wasn't gone. It was simply irrelevant to my new system. Ethan and I stood in the silence amidst the chaotic evidence of our defiance. "It's over," he whispered, a hint of awe in his voice. "It's over," I confirmed. "But it's not the end of the scorekeeping." My parents flew home that afternoon. The next day I received two final communications. The first was a notification from my bank. My tuition for the next semester was paid in full and my allowance had been doubled with no strings attached. It was their final silent attempt to purchase my compliance through financial optimization, a clean and efficient severance package. The second communication was a text from Mia, MIA. They reinstated my early application. They said my loyalty recalibration was successful, but they want weekly check-ins. "Thank you, Sarah. You showed them the cost of the score." My sister had her future back. She had played the perfect compliant asset one last time, proving to our parents that her recalibration was complete while simultaneously using her freedom to text me the good news. She had mastered the art of the efficient lie. For the first time since starting college, I skipped the Sunday night video conference. The phone rang precisely at 8:00 p.m. I looked at the screen, saw Dad's cell, and let it ring until it stopped. The silence that followed was the sound of my own sovereignty. My life wasn't suddenly perfect, but it was mine. The routine was broken, but the instinct to analyze and quantify remained. Instead of fighting that instinct, I redirected it. I created a new spreadsheet, the inventory of freedom. Metric: emotional overhead, yield time spent with Ethan talking about anything and everything. Score: highest possible yield. Metric: time waste hours spent reading fiction, watching random documentaries, or just sitting under the oak tree. Score: necessary for cognitive sustainability. Metric: financial allocation, subjective utility, money spent on tickets to a band I loved. Score: high, ROI, enjoy. Metric: projected deviation. My future plans, messy and undefined. Score: unquantifiable, the highest asset. I finally understood the core flaw in my parents' tradition. They tried to measure the value of life by tracking its cost. They missed the entire yield. I called Ethan and we walked to the campus park, the old rigid time limits completely forgotten. We sat side by side watching a group of students play touch football, an entirely inefficient, joyful activity. "So," Ethan said, nudging me gently, "what's the final score, Sarah? Did you win?" I smiled, closing the old wound left by the system. "There are no scores anymore, Ethan. There's just ROI." I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, and the return on investment for choosing my own normal 100%. I had escaped the confines of the family routine, and in doing so had finally quantified the most valuable asset of all: freedom.